I was his mistress. But when he died, I found the perfect wife. Had 3 lovers and secret money. It was 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon when I walked into Robert Chamberlain's funeral. I'd been his mistress for 11 years, and I expected his widow to destroy me the moment I showed my face. I wore a black dress I'd bought specifically for this, nothing fancy, trying to blend in at the back of the church. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I'd rehearsed what I'd say if Margaret confronted me, if she screamed at me in front of everyone, if she had security throw me out. But when I finally spotted her in the front pew, draped in designer black with a veil covering her face, she turned and looked right through me. Not angry, not hurt, just empty, like I didn't matter at all. That's when something cold settled in my stomach. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. I'm Claire Jennings. I'm 43 years old, and for the past 11 years I'd been sleeping with a married man. Not my proudest confession, but I'm done lying about it. Robert was 58 when he died of a heart attack in his office downtown. We met at a conference in Chicago back in 2014. He was a commercial real estate developer, the kind of guy who bought entire city blocks and turned them into something profitable. I was working in marketing for a hotel chain. We got to talking at the bar after the keynote, and one conversation turned into 3 hours, turned into him asking if I wanted to get breakfast the next morning, turned into him booking an extra night at the hotel. I knew he was married. He told me up front. Said things with Margaret were complicated, that they stayed together for appearances, that she had her life, and he had his. I should have walked away right then. I didn't. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I liked how he looked at me like I was the only person in the room. Maybe I just wanted to feel special for once in my goddamn life. So I became the other woman. The secret. The shame he kept in a nice apartment in Brooklyn that he paid for. Seeing him twice a week when he could slip away from his real life in Connecticut. For 11 years, I lived in that apartment. For 11 years, I waited for his texts, canceled plans when he called, spent holidays alone because he was with his family. For 11 years, I told myself he'd leave her eventually, even though deep down I knew he never would. And when he died, I figured that was it. Game over. Margaret wins. I'd slink back into whatever life I could salvage. Probably move out of the city, try to forget I'd wasted over a decade on someone else's husband. But at that funeral, watching Margaret play the grieving widow with an Oscar-worthy performance, something felt off. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. She accepted condolences from his business partners with the perfect mix of strength and vulnerability. She was magnificent, and she didn't spare me a single real glance. 3 days after the funeral, a man knocked on my apartment door. He was in his 60s, wearing a suit that screamed money, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Howard Chen, Robert's personal attorney. Not his business attorney, his personal one. I didn't even know Robert had a separate personal attorney. Howard said Robert had left specific instructions. If he died, Howard was supposed to wait 72 hours after the funeral, then deliver an envelope to me personally. My heart started pounding. I thought maybe Robert had left me some money, enough to cover a few months' rent while I figured out my next move. Something to ease his guilt from beyond the grave. Howard handed me a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax like something out of a movie. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said Robert had been very specific. I was to read everything inside alone. I was to follow the instructions exactly, and I was not, under any circumstances, to contact Margaret or anyone in his family until I'd completed what he'd asked. I closed the door and sat on my couch, staring at that envelope for 20 minutes. My hands were shaking again. Part of me wanted to throw it away, pretend none of this ever happened, move on with my life. But I'd spent 11 years loving this man. I owed him at least this much. I owed myself the truth of whatever he'd left behind. I broke the seal. Inside was a letter in Robert's handwriting, 3 pages long, and a small silver key attached to a business card for a storage facility in Queens. The letter started simple enough. He said he loved me. Said he was sorry for how complicated everything had been. Said he'd always meant to make things right but ran out of time. Typical Robert, apologizing without really changing anything. Then the letter got weird. He said if I was reading this, It meant he was gone, and I needed to know the truth about Margaret. He said he'd spent the last 3 years investigating her, that he'd hired a private investigator, that what he'd discovered had shocked him so completely, he'd spent months figuring out what to do about it. He said he couldn't tell me while he was alive because he didn't want to put me in danger. Danger. That word jumped off the page. He said the key would open a storage unit where he'd kept all the evidence. He said once I saw what was inside, I'd understand everything, and he said I'd have to make a choice about what to do next. The letter ended with a line I'll never forget. He wrote, "Claire, I loved you because you were real. Margaret is a lot of things, but real isn't one of them. Be careful." I sat there holding those pages, my mind racing. What the hell had Robert discovered? What kind of danger had he been protecting me from? And why leave me this burden instead of just handling it himself? But I already knew I was going to that storage unit. Curiosity, grief, anger, love. All of it mixed together into something I couldn't ignore. I grabbed my purse, grabbed my keys, and headed for Queens. The storage facility was one of those big warehouse places off the expressway. Rows and rows of orange garage doors stretching into the distance. Unit 217 was in the back corner, away from the main entrance. I used the key. The lock clicked. I rolled up the door. Inside was a folding table, a chair, and 4 banker boxes stacked neatly on top of each other. Nothing else. Just those boxes in an empty concrete room. I pulled the chair over and opened the first box. Files. Dozens of files, each one labeled with a date and a name. I pulled one out at random. It was a surveillance report from April of last year, detailing Margaret's movements over a 48-hour period. She'd driven to Manhattan, met a man named David Kowalski at a hotel bar, checked into a room with him, left 6 hours later. I opened another file. This one tracked her to Philadelphia. Another man, different hotel. James Morrison, according to the investigator's notes. 2 nights that time. Photos included. Margaret in the hotel lobby. Margaret and James having dinner. Margaret kissing James in the parking garage. I felt sick, not because Robert had been cheating on his wife with me while she cheated on him. The hypocrisy of that wasn't lost on me, but because of the scale of it. Box after box of evidence. Margaret had 3 regular lovers that Robert's investigator had confirmed. David in Manhattan, James in Philadelphia, and a 3rd guy named Carlos Hernandez who lived in Miami. She'd been juggling all 3 for at least 5 years, based on the earliest reports in the files, but it got worse. The second box wasn't about affairs. It was about money, financial records, bank statements, wire transfers. Margaret had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, hundreds of thousands at first, then millions. Over the course of 8 years, she'd funneled nearly $12 million out of Robert's reach, hiding it in shell companies and trusts he'd never known existed. The 3rd box contained more financial documents, but these ones detailed how she'd done it. Margaret had convinced Robert to put her in charge of their personal finances years ago, claiming she wanted to be more involved in their wealth management. He'd agreed, thinking it would make her happy, give her something to focus on. Instead, she'd use that access to slowly drain accounts, forge his signature on documents, set up fake investment funds that she controlled entirely. Robert had figured it out about 3 years ago, according to his notes. He'd noticed discrepancies, started asking questions. Margaret had covered beautifully, showed him paperwork that made everything look legitimate, but Robert was a developer. He knew how to smell a financial con, so he'd hired the investigator. And over 3 years, that investigator had documented every cent Margaret had stolen, every lie she'd told, every affair she'd conducted behind his back. The 4th box was the most disturbing. It contained Robert's analysis of Margaret's psychology, pages and pages of his handwriting, working through his thoughts. He'd concluded that Margaret was a sociopath, not in the casual sense people throw that word around, but clinically. She showed no genuine emotion. She mimicked feelings to get what she wanted. She manipulated everyone around her with surgical precision. She'd married Robert for his money, played the perfect wife for decades, and was systematically destroying him financially while maintaining her image as the victim of his infidelity. Because she knew about me. Of course she did. She'd known for years. Robert had proof of that too. Emails between Margaret and her sister discussing me, mocking me, calling me Robert's pathetic little midlife crisis. Margaret had known about me and had used it as justification for her own behavior, as leverage in case Robert ever tried to divorce her. She'd been 10 steps ahead the entire time. I sat in that storage unit for 3 hours, reading every document, looking at every photo, absorbing the full scope of what Robert had discovered. My head was spinning. This woman I'd thought of as the enemy, the wife I'd helped betray, was actually a monster. And Robert had documented everything but never confronted her. Why? The answer was in a sealed letter at the bottom of the 4th box. This one was addressed to me, dated 6 months before he died. Robert wrote that he'd spent a year trying to figure out how to handle Margaret. If he confronted her, she'd destroy him. She had too much leverage, too many connections, too much dirt. If he tried to freeze her out financially, she'd go to the media, paint herself as the victim of his affair with me, ruin his business reputation. If he tried to divorce her, she'd drag it out for years, cost him millions in legal fees, and probably still walk away with half his wealth. So he'd decided to do something different. He'd set up a separate will with Howard Chen, one that Margaret didn't know about. In that will, he'd left me everything. Not the Connecticut house or the visible assets. Those would go to Margaret to maintain appearances. But he'd moved $28 million into a trust that only I could access. Money he'd squirreled away over the past 2 years, liquidating investments quietly, selling properties through back channels, building a fortune that Margaret had no idea existed. The letter explained his reasoning. He said Margaret had stolen from him, so he'd steal from her right back. But more than that, he wanted me taken care of. He said I'd given him 11 years of genuine love and honesty, even if our relationship was built on lies to everyone else. He said I deserved a real life, not the scraps of attention he'd been giving me. And he said if I wanted revenge against Margaret, all the evidence I needed was in those boxes. But he also warned me. Margaret wasn't stupid. If she found out about the trust, she'd come after me. She'd use every weapon in her arsenal to get that money back. So I had a choice. Take the money, disappear, start over somewhere far from New York, or stay, expose her, and deal with the consequences. I drove back to Brooklyn in a daze. $28 million. Evidence of affairs and fraud and psychological manipulation. Robert had handed me a nuclear bomb and told me to decide whether to detonate it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Margaret at the funeral, so composed, so perfect. I thought about how she'd looked through me like I was nothing, because to her, I was nothing. I was just a tool she'd used to justify her own betrayals, a convenient excuse for her theft and infidelity. Part of me wanted to burn her life down, take everything Robert had left me and make sure everyone knew what she'd done. His family, his business partners, the society friends who'd patted her hand and told her what a saint she was for standing by him despite his affair. I wanted to watch her perfect facade crumble, but another part of me was terrified. Robert had been scared of her. A man who'd built a real estate empire, who'd negotiated with mob-connected contractors and cutthroat investors, had been afraid of his own wife. What did that say about what she was capable of? I spent 2 days agonizing over it. I called Howard Chen and asked him about the trust. He confirmed everything. The money was mine, legally airtight, completely separate from Robert's estate. Margaret couldn't touch it. I could access it whenever I wanted. I could walk away from all of this with enough money to never worry about anything again. And then Margaret showed up at my door. It was 7 o'clock on a Saturday night. I'd just gotten out of the shower, was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, hair wet, no makeup. I opened the door and there she was. Margaret Chamberlain, designer clothes, perfect hair, that same empty smile from the funeral. She said, "Hello, Claire. May I come in?" Not a question. A statement. She walked past me into my apartment like she owned it. Like she'd paid for it. Which, technically, her husband had. But the confidence in her stride made my skin crawl. She sat on my couch, crossed her legs, looked around the apartment with mild interest, like she was touring a museum exhibit about how poor people lived. Then she looked at me and said, "I know Robert left you something." My heart stopped. How could she know? Howard had assured me the will was sealed, that Margaret had no idea about the trust. Unless... She continued. She said Robert wasn't as clever as he thought. She'd known for 6 months that he was moving money around. She'd known he was planning something. She'd had her own investigator following his investigator. She knew about the storage unit. She knew about Howard Chen. She didn't know exactly how much he'd left me, but she knew it was substantial. I found my voice. I said, "Why are you here?" Margaret smiled. It was the scariest thing I'd ever seen. She said, "Because we both know what Robert left you isn't just money. He left you evidence, files, documents, things that could make my life very difficult if they became public." She stood up, walked to my window, looked out at the street below. She said, "Here's what's going to happen, Claire. You're going to take your money and disappear. You're going to move far away from New York. You're going to change your name, start over, live whatever life you want. And you're going to forget everything you saw in those boxes." I said, "And if I don't?" She turned to face me. The smile was gone. She said, "Then I'll destroy you. I have lawyers who specialize in making people's lives hell. I have connections in law enforcement, in the IRS, in every corner of society that matters. I'll tie you up in legal battles until you're broke. I'll make sure everyone knows you were sleeping with my husband. I'll paint you as a gold-digging whore who's trying to steal from a widow. By the time I'm done, you'll wish Robert had left you nothing." I felt my jaw clench. I said, "I have evidence of what you did. The affairs. The money you stole. Everything." Margaret laughed. Actually laughed. She said, "Do you really think anyone will care? I'm the widow. You're the mistress. Who do you think people will believe? Who do you think they'll sympathize with?" She walked to the door, then turned back. She said, "But I'm not unreasonable. I know Robert probably told you terrible things about me. I know you have information that could embarrass me. So here's my offer. Take your money, leave New York, and I'll add another $5 million to it. Cash, untraceable. Yours to do whatever you want with. Consider it a gift for your discretion." I stared at her. $5 million. On top of the $28 million Robert had left me. $33 million total, just for walking away and keeping my mouth shut. She said, "Think about it. You get to be rich and free. You get to start over. All you have to do is let me keep my reputation. That's a pretty good deal, don't you think?" Then she left, just like that, walked out of my apartment and my life, leaving me standing there with her offer hanging in the air like poison. I didn't sleep that night either. I paced my apartment until sunrise, thinking through every angle. Margaret was right about one thing. If I tried to expose her, it would be my word against hers. Sure, I had Robert's evidence, but she had money and power and the sympathy of being the grieving widow. She could afford better lawyers than I could. She could drag everything out for years. She could make my life a nightmare, but if I took her deal, I'd be letting her get away with everything. She'd keep her reputation. She'd keep the money she'd stolen from Robert. She'd keep playing the victim while secretly living as a thief and a fraud. And then I remembered something from Robert's letter. A line I'd skipped over in my first reading, too overwhelmed to process it fully. He'd written, "Claire, whatever you decide, know that I trust you to do what's right. Not what's easy. What's right." I pulled out the letter and read it again. Slowly this time. Robert had known Margaret would come after me. He'd predicted it. That's why he'd been so careful with the documentation. Why he'd set everything up through Howard Chen. Why he'd moved the money so thoroughly that Margaret couldn't touch it. But he'd also left me a choice. He could have exposed her himself before he died. Could have gone to the police with the fraud evidence. Could have divorced her and made everything public. He hadn't. He'd left that decision to me. And suddenly I understood why. Robert had loved me, in his way, but he'd also been a coward. He'd never had the guts to leave Margaret, to face the consequences of his choices, to stand up for what he really wanted. He'd lived in the middle ground, keeping me as his secret, and Margaret as his public life, never fully committing to either. He'd left me the evidence because he couldn't handle the responsibility of using it. He'd wanted me to make the hard choice he'd never been brave enough to make himself. I thought about my life. 43 years old. 11 years spent as someone's secret. No real relationships. No career to speak of. Since I'd basically lived off Robert's money. No identity beyond being the other woman. If I took Margaret's deal and disappeared, I'd be free financially. But I'd still be hiding. Still be the secret. Still be defined by my relationship to a man who was dead. But if I stayed and fought, even if I lost, I'd be standing up for something. I'd be choosing dignity over money. I'd be refusing to let Margaret win just because she was scarier and richer and more connected. And maybe, just maybe, I'd be showing Robert that at least one of us could be brave. I called Howard Chen the next morning. I told him I wanted to access the trust. I wanted to move forward with everything Robert had planned. And I wanted to hire him to help me file a civil suit against Margaret for fraud and theft. Howard was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Are you sure? This is going to be ugly. She's going to fight with everything she has." I said, "I know. But I'm done being the woman in the shadows. I'm done letting people like her get away with things just because they're good at playing victim." Howard said he'd draw up the papers. The lawsuit hit the news 3 weeks later. I filed for fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary duty, asking for the return of the $12 million Margaret had stolen, plus damages. I included documentation from Robert's investigation, bank records, everything. Margaret's lawyers came out swinging. They called me a scorned mistress trying to profit from a widow's grief. They claimed the evidence was fabricated. They filed countersuits for defamation and harassment. They tried to freeze the trust Robert had left me, claiming it was part of the marital estate. They failed on that, but they made everything else as difficult as possible. The media had a field day. Articles about the mistress versus the widow. Opinion pieces about who deserved sympathy. My face plastered everywhere. People recognized me on the street. Some called me brave. Others called me a homewrecker. I lost count of the death threats, but something interesting happened. As the case progressed, as more evidence became public, as Margaret's financial dealings got scrutinized, the narrative started to shift. Reporters started digging. They found inconsistencies in her story. They found the offshore accounts. They found proof of the wire transfers. They even found evidence of her affairs, though that was harder to prove and less relevant legally. 6 months into the lawsuit, Margaret's lawyers approached Howard with a settlement offer. She'd return $8 million of the 12 she'd stolen, admit to no wrongdoing, and we'd both sign NDAs agreeing never to speak about the case publicly. I turned it down. Howard thought I was crazy. He said $8 million was a good recovery. He said we might not win at trial, that juries were unpredictable, that Margaret could still find a way to twist things. But I didn't care about the money anymore. I had $28 million. I was set for life. What I cared about was the truth. I wanted Margaret to face real consequences. I wanted her to lose something that mattered to her, the same way she'd spent years taking from Robert. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Margaret sat at the defense table every day, perfectly composed, playing the grieving widow for the jury. Her lawyers were good. They made me look bad. They brought up every mistake I'd ever made. They painted me as a gold digger, a homewrecker, someone who'd do anything for money. But Howard was better. He walked the jury through every document, every forged signature, every wire transfer, every offshore account. He showed them the pattern of theft over 8 years. He proved that Margaret had systematically stolen from her husband while maintaining her image as the perfect wife. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, they found in my favor. Margaret was ordered to return the full $12 million, plus interest, plus punitive damages of another $3 million for the fraud. She was also ordered to pay my legal fees. Margaret's face when the verdict was read was the most genuine emotion I'd ever seen from her. Pure rage. For just a second, the mask slipped, and I saw the real person underneath. She looked at me across the courtroom, and I saw murder in her eyes. I didn't care. I'd won. The aftermath was messy. Margaret appealed, of course. That dragged on for another year. But eventually, every appeal failed. She had to pay. The offshore accounts were seized. Her reputation was destroyed. Robert's family, who'd initially sided with her, turned against her when they realized how much she'd stolen from their inheritance. She tried to come after me one more time. Had someone break into my apartment, trash the place, steal anything valuable. The police couldn't prove it was her, but I knew it was her last attempt to hurt me. So I moved, left New York for good, bought a house in Oregon, right on the coast, where I can see the ocean from my bedroom window. I changed my name, not legally, but socially, started going by my middle name, built a life that has nothing to do with Robert or Margaret or any of that mess. It's been 3 years now. I'm 46 years old. I volunteer at an animal shelter twice a week. I take art classes at the community college. I've made actual friends, people who know me as Sarah from the coast, the quiet woman who always brings homemade cookies to the beach cleanups. Sometimes I wonder if Robert would be proud of what I did, if he'd be happy that I chose to fight instead of hide. I'll never know, but I know I'm proud of myself. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not someone's secret. I'm not defined by my relationship to a man. I'm not hiding who I am or what I did. Was it worth it? The lawsuit, the media circus, the year of stress and fear? Honestly, yes, because I learned something important. Money can't buy dignity. Power can't erase truth. And sometimes, doing the right thing means doing the hard thing, even when the easy thing would make you richer and safer. Margaret still lives in Connecticut, in that big house Robert bought. She still goes to charity events, still plays the society woman. But everyone knows what she is now. Every conversation she has, every room she walks into, people know she's a fraud. She lost the one thing she valued most, her reputation, and I took it from her. Some people would say that makes me vindictive. Maybe it does. But I prefer to think of it as justice. Robert couldn't stand up to her. He loved me, but he loved his comfortable lie more. So I stood up for both of us. I took the evidence he left, the money he saved, and the courage I'd spent 11 years losing, and I used all of it to make sure Margaret faced consequences. Today, when I watch the sunset over the Pacific, I think about how different my life could have been if I'd taken her deal. If I'd disappeared with $33 million and let her keep pretending, I'd be richer, safer, more comfortable. But I wouldn't be free. Not really. Because I'd know that I'd chosen money over truth, comfort over courage, hiding over standing up. Instead, I chose to fight. And yeah, it was hard. It was ugly. It cost me more than money could measure. But every time I look at the ocean, every time I introduce myself with my real name, every time I walk into a room and don't have to hide who I am or what I've done, I know I made the right choice. Robert left me a fortune. But what he really left me was a choice between staying in the shadows and stepping into the light, between being his secret forever and claiming my own life, between letting Margaret win because she was scarier and proving that even the woman in the shadows can fight back. I chose the light, and I'd make the same choice again every single time.